the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee. Be happily through Christ our Lord. Amen. Mary, seat of wisdom, pray for us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So the topic of this conference is modesty in speech. And before we actually talk about modesty in speech, we need to talk about the nature of modesty itself. You've heard me say that St. Thomas says that modesty, part of it is because it depends on circumspection, but it's like circumspection in the sense that he says it's one of the first corrupted and the last perfected. In fact, every single sin that we commit externally, not those in thought, but in speech or in action, violates modesty already. So every time you commit an external sin, you've already chiseled away at your modesty. And so what we want to do, though, is talk about how this affects modesty in speech and how the various sins that you see that people commit against the virtue of modesty in relationship to speech. So, but first, the actual object. So we want to talk about the actual definition of modesty. Modesty is defined by St. Thomas as a virtue residing in the concupiscible appetite, which moderates pleasure regarding externals. Now, what he means by that is, at least it's generally considered to be in the concupiscible appetite, because it deals with pleasure in regard. So we get a certain amount of pleasure out of talking. We get a certain amount of pleasure out of doing certain things just on a physical, like just sometimes even just walking. We can get a certain kind of a pleasure out of doing certain things. How we sit. In other words, our external behavior, we can get pleasure out of our external behavior, in the concupiscible appetite in relationship to those externals that we actually do. Obviously, we're not talking about areas of the Sixth Commandment necessarily, although it can be. So a lot of people tend to think that modesty has to do only with how you dress, and that's actually not true. The object of modesty, because it deals with externals, deals with three things. The first is speech, and then comportment, and then that is how you carry yourself, things like that, in action. And it can also deal with other externals. So, for example, one of the indicators that people don't have modesty is they'll drive around in a Cadillac, but they live in a shack. Okay, this is an indicator that there's a particular problem there. It's a lack of modesty. Or people who, and their externals are in their dress is one of the principal ways. So speech, comportment, and then dress are the three areas primarily, but the other externals are considered part of the dress. So like if your house is outside your state in life, or if it's below your state in life, that can also be a lack of modesty. Because modesty is a virtue that lies in the mean between excess and defect, and so there are certain things we're going to talk about how that finds itself in relationship to the various areas of modesty. But I want to talk about principally modesty in speech. That's why we're not going to talk about modesty in dress. I've already done some stuff like that online. And in modesty in comportment, this would be everything from how I walk to how I sit. So for example, if a woman is sitting in a way that is suggestive, contrary to the Sixth Commandment, that's against modesty. On the other hand, slouching and not sitting upright when you should be sitting upright, or carrying yourself in a dignified manner, like walking around hungover, or just bent over all the time, can also be against modesty. So your gait should be natural. It should not be. So these are all things that deal with comportment and action and things of that sort. We're not going to go into all those because there's a lot in those. I just want to focus primarily on modesty in speech. Because we get a pleasure out of talking, it means, therefore, that that pleasure has to be regulated. It has to be mortified, ultimately. But it has to get to the point where the concupiscible appetite has sufficient virtue, and that's what the modesty does, it regulates or moderates the pleasure that we get out of talking. And the talking can be in a variety of different ways. Just as in temperance, it's not just how much you eat, it's how you eat, how quickly you eat, what you eat. It's all those things can determine the virtue of temperance in relationship to modesty. It's the same thing in the sense that there, as you'll see here in just a minute, there's a number of different facets in relationship to modesty that people tend to violate in relationship to their speech. This is obviously becoming a big problem. We're going to see specifically what aspect of modesty that it violates. But you see this online where people get on there and they say things online they would never say in front of somebody because they wouldn't have the fortitude to do so. Or they just simply would have too much human respect to do so or what have you. Okay. So we get a certain amount of pleasure in the speech. So speech is actually regulated by several virtues. One is the veracity, the virtue of veracity. It has to be true. If it's not true, it's obviously not modest. But it also, the speech has to be fit time and circumstances, and that's what we're going to talk about here in a minute. But there's more than one virtue that actually regulates speech. It's also regulated, obviously, by prudence. So what you say to somebody, or how you say it even, is determined by prudence. But if the prudence isn't properly developed, then one will end up saying things that are immodest in the sense that they're not properly regulated. Okay. The principal foundation for modesty is the sub-virtue in relationship to speech, is the sub-virtue of decorum. So in addition to just basic temperance and tempering the pleasure we get out of the talking, it's also decorum. Now in decorum we've talked a little bit about in my prior conferences, but we want to talk more precisely what decorum actually means. So decorum comes from the Latin word deture, which means to suit, that one thing suits another. And we know that A suits B, and by suit we mean that, it comes together in some fashion. In fact, what's kind of interesting is that the Latin word for suit, one thing suiting another, or suitability, is conveniens, which comes from the two Latin words cum venire, which means to come together. They're able to, you can put them together and they actually fit, right? And so this is something in which in decorum, one thing fits another thing. And what does it mean that one thing fits another thing? It means that there's something in A that is the same as the thing that's in B. So for example, this is something which I actually wrote an article on this, that I think that many forms of the modern liturgy are actually immodest because what they're doing, A, does not fit B. So if I am offering the Mass to God, then I should really be facing east where God rises, etc., historically, and not the people, because the people are not to whom I am offering the Mass. And so there's a lack of suitability regarding that, because what's the sameness? If my action would be suitable if I am facing God, so my facing implicitly it's directed towards God, and God is the one to whom it's directed. So the A part, that's me, is directing it towards God, and God is B, that towards which I'm actually moving. This brings up an important thing, because there is a distinction in theology between what's called the Finis, operis, and the Finis operantis. The Finis operis is the end of the work. It's what the very nature of the work is ordered towards. This was the foundation for the inseparability of the unitive and procreative elements in the conjugal act that Paul VI was talking about. Because the Finis operis, the very nature of union, is ordered towards, its very trajectory built into the nature of that action is children. So that's what it's ordered towards, right? We also would say, like, if I'm throwing a baseball, then the Finis operis is that it goes over the pitcher's mound, and that's what the Finis operis, that's what's intrinsically contained within that. or if I shoot somebody in the head, I mean, I hate to use a graphic example. Well, shooting somebody in the head, the finis operis of that is death, right? That's the very nature of the action that it's tending towards. This is an objective reality. It is the reality regardless of what we tend to think or want. It's just the very structure built into the nature of the action that I'm performing. So in the case of speech, the very nature of speech, St. Thomas says, is to convey the truth that's in my mind. So I have a truth that's in my mind, and the speech, by its very nature, is ordered towards conveying that truth to someone who's actually hearing it. That's its built-in trajectory. This is why he says that lying is wrong, not because of the deception part, although that can be also true too, but not all deception is evil. He says it's wrong because you're violating the very structure of the natural law in how God structured the faculty of speech to perform an action. Its built-in structure is to convey the truth. So the finis operis is the end towards which the very nature of the action is ordered towards doing. This is why the example I sometimes give is throwing midgets off of a building, right? My intention might be, because I want to have the midgets enjoy the flight, right? But that's not the nature of the action. The nature of the action is ordered towards death, right? Because they're going to hit the ground and they're going to die. So this is a key thing to keep in mind, because that means that every single action we perform has an objective content, and that objective content is partially determined by the finis operis, that towards which the nature of that action inherently or naturally tends. And that's objective, independent of what we actually want to think or feel, okay? This is one of the reasons why, especially when it comes to modesty, something is going to be objectively modest based on a few things, but one, the finis operis, what I'm saying, how I'm saying it, etc., but the saying of the thing, but then also several other things. Okay, so decorum, back up. That is distinct from the finis operantis, which is the intention or the end of the doer. The translation is the end of the doer. Why am I doing it? What's my intention? Because my intention it may be one and the same with the finis operis, or it may not be one and the same with the finis operis. And so in relationship to decorum and speech specifically, it means that the first aspect of modesty that must be observed is truth. If the truth is not being conveyed by its very nature, then we know de facto that what the person is saying is immodest. Why is it immodest? Because it's not properly regulated. What does it mean to regulate? It means to regulate a thing means that there is some agency which is performing the action that can be measured by an objective standard. That's what that means. To regulate a thing means that this thing has the ability to determine the action of a thing according to reason. So even if I have like a regulator on a gas thing, its whole function is to measure or meter the thing so that it doesn't have too much or too little. But that's according to an objective intellectual standard. So when we're talking about speech, it's supposed to regulate the speech in such a manner that the speech adheres up to an objective standard. That's what right reason does. It recognizes, okay, this is the truth of the matter, and then when I speak, there's that standard of truth that this thing measures actually up to it. So the first, and that means that the truth in the intellect and the truth in my speech, that's the sameness from which that means there's a decorum in what I'm saying, at least on that level. And then as a result of that, at least I have a foundational sense of decorum. If they don't, what I know in my intellect does not fit B, what I'm saying. And therefore there's an indecorum. And so that the fact that it's indecorous means that it's de facto immodest, because I'm not regulating my speech according to right reason. So even though it is that modesty regulates the pleasure, that pleasure is regulated by reason, by a set of objective standards. So this is a very important point, because that we say something that is rightly ordered or in the right context, and that it's actually modest in the very nature of what we say. By the way, we're not necessarily talking about the sixth commandment, but we'll get to that later. We're talking about just there's certain things you say to certain people, and if it's not regulated by reason, then it's automatically immodest. I'll give you 2 examples of immodesty that is extraordinarily common. When we get angry, we say things, and that the saying of the thing is we're not regulating the pleasure we get out of saying the thing that's hurtful to the individual in order to shut them up, or whatever the case is. And so that lack of regulation according to reason, and we just kind of let pleasure run in excess in that particular situation. So this is one of the reasons why we have to, so anytime we express anger, either in comportment or in our speech, it's de facto immodest. Okay. This is, again, why St. Thomas says, because all of us do that to some degree or another, this is exactly why St. Thomas says that modesty is the last perfected, because it requires, in order for modesty to be perfect in all aspects, you have to have your interior life extraordinarily rightly ordered, and most people simply do not. Okay. Another area is when people try and take charge in a situation by the sin of usurpation when it's not their place to do so. We see that where people just barge in, and because they think they know, they think the knowledge is itself, I'm going to return to that particular aspect, the knowledge itself gives them the justification to do or say the thing or to take charge in the manner that they think. When in point in fact, the knowledge has, that just means you know. Doesn't mean you have the authority, which is the right to make determinations in this particular case. Those are 2 entirely different things. But as human beings, our thinking is pretty clouded, and it's not very precise a lot of times. Okay. So the first then is the decorum in the very truthfulness of what we say. But that truthfulness, okay, so the action, so when A says something to B, the circumstances, there are several circumstances that surround that whole process. So the suitability is not just between A and B, but the suitability has to do with how A relates to the external circumstances, how B relates to the external circumstances, and how the very nature of what I'm saying relates to the external circumstances. All of those have to be, there has to be decorum in each one of those, suitability in each one of those, in order for there to be true modesty. So that means then we want to go into the circumstances, because that's ultimately what we have to take a look at when we want to make sure our speech is modest. So I'll give you just kind of an example. What a wife might say to her husband in private, in an intimate setting, is she cannot go out in public and say that same thing, or a man, for that matter, in relationship to his wife. While it might be modest because it fits the circumstances when they're in an intimate set of circumstances, etc., it does not suit what's going if they're standing in public. So this is something that gives you an indicator that it's not just what we say, it's to whom we're saying it, who's saying it, and how it's being said, and the context in which it's being said, all of that. So we want to go into that. The first, then, is who is saying it. There are certain things which suit it being said by one individual and not another. So, for example, correcting, let's say, so for example, in correcting, like if you live in a community of priests and it's one guy just goes over and automatically just corrects someone else in that circumstances, the problem is that he's not the superior. It's the superior's place to correct him. So the correction, what he says in the correction, is immodest because it's not being regulated by reason, because reason recognizes that the suitability part of this is that it's the superior's place to say something. And then if the superior doesn't say something, or if the circumstances are a little bit different and the superior is not there, and something does actually needs to be said, most people can't make the distinction between need and want, but it needs to be said, then you would say something, but that's because of the external circumstances dictate the need for it. So who says something? This is one of the reasons why, like, for example, as a priest, there are certain things I cannot say publicly, or I cannot even say even privately. There's some things that priests will discuss amongst themselves that there's no way we'd be able to discuss publicly, because if we did, it would cause scandal to certain people, like, for example, certain knowledge that we have of what's going on within the church in the context of which bishop is doing what, or which cardinal has said what. And so we can discuss it amongst ourselves because of the necessity to know and what needs to, but if we were to say this publicly, it would be another matter. Or if a priest was to discuss certain matters pertaining to the sixth commandment, then as a general rule, unless the circumstances are just right, that is, and even then it has to be regulated and done in a way, the manner which is fits time and place. There are certain things he wouldn't discuss in relationship to the sixth commandment that he might, if, say, a couple comes in and asks, some very key or pointed questions about what is permissible or not, then he would start talking about those things in a very frank but modest manner, and not in a salacious manner or anything like that, but he could talk about, okay, in this particular case, you can do X, but you can't do Y. He wouldn't get up on the pulpit and start talking about those things because of who and what he actually is. It's the same, or even what he would say a priest, what he would say to a young woman. There are certain things that he should not be saying to a young woman that, say, a young bachelor could legitimately say to a young woman, and those would be modest in relationship to the young bachelor, because there's a possibility that they might be able to enter into courtship, but that's not the case in relationship to the priest. So who the individual is determines how it is to be said, or what can be said in order to be modest. This is true among parents in relationship to their children. This is even true in relationship to, like, say, for example, the wife sees something that the husband is doing that needs to be addressed. Well, modesty would indicate that she does not correct him in front of the children. She waits until the circumstances are right and then talks about it with her husband privately once he's properly disposed. But you don't do it in front of the children, because that would be immodest, because it's contrary to the set of circumstances. It's also contrary to prudence. So who says it? You have to look at who is saying this in relationship to someone else. This becomes an important point, because a lot of times today people, out of a motivation of human respect, a lot of times will say things or do things when it's immodest. So, for example, Catholics will say things which are contrary to the Catholic faith just to fit in. So, in addition to saying something contrary to the faith, you've also violated modesty based on who and what you actually are. Okay. The next that I want to talk about is in relationship to the speech is how much is said. Okay, so this is usually not contained in normal circumstances, but we want to talk about the quantity which is said. Okay, now first we want to talk a little bit about the psychology of why people talk too much. The primary reason is because, as I mentioned, we get a pleasure out of talking. The second thing is we get a pleasure out of thinking about our own ideas. And this results, especially if we know the truth, there's a pleasure we get out of knowing the truth. And as a result of that, there can be a tendency towards immodesty, that is talking too much. So this you'll see this play itself out from time to time. So one time my dad was recounting this story about how he and my mom went over across the street to our neighbors, who are very good neighbors. They're They're very helpful. They're good Christian people. They're not Catholic, but they're good Christian people. And they'll like watch out for my parents and stuff like that and things of that sort. And they will take your garbage out and things like that if you need it done and things of that sort. So they go over to their house, but they had invited this guy who was a lawyer. And this guy, my dad said, didn't, quote, he did not shut up the entire hour we were there, unquote. Right? Okay. He just kept talking and talking and talking and talking. And there's two problems with this. First of all, other than the fact that he's effeminate, but by pursuing pleasure over just, being quiet. But the other part of it is that because we get a pleasure out of our own ideas, what this does is this results in us judging that our ideas are more important. That is, we judge them to excess regarding their importance than they actually are. If you look at what 95% of what most people say, now there can be a legitimate circumstance where you're just kind of entering into, a conversation, because that talk and discussion, because some people say, well, you should just sit there silently. Well, no, actually, because of the nature of us as human beings, that charity can be actually served in discussing things with people. But a lot of times what you'll do is you'll get people who, in a discussion, they just talk all the time. And it's because A, they get a pleasure out of what they think they're certain about, or even if they are certain about it, they can get pleasure out of it. They get a pleasure out of their thoughts, and then as a result of that, because other people they judge in that excess, I know, but the other people don't know, so I need to make sure that they know. And so there's this kind of pleasure in not just being able to talk, which we'll see, but also just being able to constantly inform people. And that is something that has to be moderated, because when you inform people, how much you inform people has to be regulated, and it can't be based upon the pleasure you get out of just conveying the truth all the time, right? It has to be regulated in relationship to that. Now, the difference between someone who just wants somebody to know and somebody who's getting the pleasure out of their own idea and the pleasure out of the talking, that is expressing that idea, because we get a pleasure out of expressing what we know is true. The difference between that and someone who thinks they need to inform other people all the time is this. The people who recognize that I need to inform these people, they're going to watch to see if the person actually is understanding, and so the conversation is going to go back and forth to some degree, right? Whereas the person but what you'll see is that there's two. Whereas the person who just wants to talk to express their ideas, they're going to talk at the person, not with the person. They're just going to be constantly telling that person what's going on. But that is the person who just wants to talk. They're just like da, 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 right? So, for example, I'll give you an example that happened to me recently. I was giving a conference, and there was a line of 18 people waiting to see me. And this woman comes up and she says, well, can I show you this now? And I said, yeah. I said, but make sure it's brief, because I already knew this woman. I said, make sure it's brief. So then what does she do? She has 3 things in a bag, and she has to go into a 5-minute explanation of something that's already written on the label that I can just read and I already know. Well, this is holy water. Yeah, I see this holy water. And I'm like, be brief, be brief, be brief. I said it to her 3 times. She was just, and she was just talking, and she literally wasn't hearing anything I said, because she was just getting the pleasure out of recounting what these things were and talking about these things, right? And I don't mean to be hacking at her. I think she's a good gal. I think she's just immoderate in her speech. But the point being is that they're talking at you rather than with you. The difference between that and someone who thinks that they need to make sure you know, and that the truth that they have in their mind, and this is another part of it is a lot of times, because we get pleasure out of the truth and the certitude that we have, when someone else brings up something of different aspect to the topic, the person that is talking, or they might bring up, yeah, it can also be X. The other person will either just dismiss this because it's not part of the pleasure of the thing that they're thinking about, or they'll just talk over the other individual and just keep talking over them. And the only time they really stop is if the other person keeps talking over them for a while, and then they kind of stop, and then they're like, well, why are you talking over me? Well, it's because you didn't see that you were talking over me, right? So there's this, it's not talking at them, it's just that desire to want to express those things. It's that desire to want to express those things and make sure that other people grasp and get to enjoy that. And some of it can be legitimate in the sense that the people want them to hear this, but it has to be moderated. People get a pleasure out of, though, and that's why they'll talk over people, is because they just want to get the pleasure out of expressing this thing fully. This is where modesty, where the rubber meets the road. This is where the fortitude, or the ability to engage in pain, it comes into contact with modesty. Because a lot of times we'll know something that's true and we get a lot of pleasure out of that truth, and then we start talking about it, and the person that we're talking about, they just go off on a tangent, they go off on something else, or they're looking at it from a completely point of view, and we have to be able to shut off our talking in relationship to this for two reasons. One is, if you just keep talking, you're not communicating with the individual. You're just at them. But the other part of it is, too, is that it's a matter to maintain the charity, because the unity that we get out of conversation comes from that back and forth, that ability to communicate with each other and not at each other. And so there has to be that ability to just shut off the talking in midstream for the sake of truth to be served, or for the sake of charity to be served, or for some other virtue to be served, independently of how we feel. So people can talk too much just out of pure the pleasure, like I mentioned in relationship with the lawyer, or they can just be talking at people, they can be talking over people. There can be, so that's by excess, and that's an indicator that there's an immodesty there, which, by the way, the immodesty tends to be even though it has different objects and aspects, it tends to be unified virtue. So if they have an immodesty in that area of speech, it usually is an indicator there's other areas in that virtue that they also lack in modesty. So, but I just say that by way of tangent. So if you're struggling in one area of modesty, just like, okay, what are the areas, plural, that I'm struggling in modesty? So that's by excess. But then you can also violate modesty by defect, where you don't talk when you should talk, or you don't say something when you should say something. So there's two parts to that. So we're all still dealing with quantity here, of how much you talk. So, for example, one of the ways that men can be immodest is the wife recognizes, or they both even might recognize, a legitimate topic needs to be discussed, right? And so they sit down, and the wife starts doing the talking, and the guy just clams up and doesn't say a thing during the entire process, right? And she starts getting frustrated because there's no communication that's actually occurring, and that is because, why? Because in relationship to the pleasure we get out of speaking externally, you can actually get a pleasure. Guys, this is interesting, because women get a pleasure more out of talking, because it's, you've heard me say this, it's ordered towards children, which is a good thing. It just has to be moderated. But guys, on the other hand, their job in life, or their structure of their brain, is ordered towards being able to work quietly on a thing and keep your focus, right? And so a lot of times guys, because they don't get near the pleasure, 1/10 the amount of pleasure out of talking than women do, they'll just shut up, and they're just happy as a clam to say nothing, right? And so they say nothing, and that's because they're getting out of the pleasure out of being silent, when they shouldn't be doing that, okay? So in relationship to that, that means that they have to be, the virtue of silence, which is a sub-virtue to the virtue of modesty in relationship to speech. It can also deal with comportment too, but we'll deal with it just here in relationship to speech. It means that the person has to be able to speak when the circumstances dictate, I need to say this, or I need to say something at this point, and they actually say something. But they don't say no more and no less. So the virtue of silence means that our tendency should be to speak infrequently, not a lot. On the other hand, it has to be careful in men that they don't get to the pleasure out of just never talking, because you can get that too, and that's immoderate, where they just get, I just rather sit here and enjoy the comfort of not saying anything. And then on the other side, but you can also get guys that talk too much, but then you can also get women who talk too much. And so, or sometimes you get women who don't talk at all. I know a person who, extracting even elementary information out of this woman is like pulling teeth without Novocaine. I mean, it's just, you'll ask her a question, what's this? It's okay. No, I didn't ask if it's okay. I need to know what the specifics are. Well, it's X. No, I need to know. I mean, it's literally like pulling teeth with this woman to get even just a modicum amount of information out of her. Okay, so that being said, although she's working on it, so she's getting better, but that means that silence is a virtue that lies in a mean, that normally speaking, we are silent. This is, by the way, talking to yourself is not necessarily sinful. It can be, but it's not necessarily sinful. Sometimes we actually have to talk things out loud so we hear it, because then our brain is able to process it a little bit better. So if we're trying to sort something out, we can maybe talk it out a little bit. And so that's not necessarily sinful. But historically, they considered talking to yourself when there's nobody else around without some other form of finality, like I mentioned, like you're trying to sort something out, or educational purposes, or you're trying to learn how to do a speech or something like that. But their basic attitude is you're doing an action to which there's no other recipient. And so this is ordered towards somebody else. So just doing it, just talking without there being a recipient was considered an immoderation in relationship to modesty, that is, in the pleasures of speech. And so they in the past, they considered it to be venially sinful to be talking to yourself without a sufficient reason. Now, I'm a little bit more benign. I think that there are some times, I think most people talk to themselves without even thinking about it. But sometimes we do have to talk to ourselves, because we have to do it in order to sort things through. But on the other hand, if there's nobody around, we should normally be quiet. This is one of the things that modern culture does not seem to get. That the nature of modesty and its sub-virtue of silence, the tendency of people, especially when they're alone, but even when they're in the presence of other people, the tendency should be more towards silence than talking, as a general rule, unless the circumstances require it. So like if you don't get to see people too often, then you would obviously sit down and talk and find out, so that you can find out where this person is and that type of thing. So quantity can be by excess or defect. And the excess, there's different kinds of excess. So you have to find out, if I'm doing this, where's the attachment to the pleasure that I'm getting? And then if it's in relationship to the defect, why don't I want to talk? What's the pleasure there? And that's usually to comfort, so you don't have to deal with it. Okay, so that's by excess. So I think generally speaking, people talk too much. This, even though it's strictly speaking not by speech, it does involve speech. I think what on these threads, and well, first of all, in the fora online, I also think that in the comment sections after videos and stuff like that, the fact that people pipe up, I mean, it's literally stream of consciousness with some of these people. They'll post something, and then they'll just say what the person said there, and then the next one is from the same person, and then it's like 2 seconds later, and then and then by the time it's done, you got 150 comments, but there's only like 2 people commenting on this thing, right? And it's because this guy's just basically constantly saying whatever comes through his mind. And that's a problem. Any posting of anything online should ultimately be done for the sake of the education of the people that are there, or to weigh in on a discussion. But that, again, has to be regulated. All the aspects which I mentioned about speech, which pleasure in ideas and pleasure in expressing them, all of that has to be regulated online. Okay. The next circumstances, in what way or how, the Latin quo modo or qualiter, how you say it. So there are 2 ways that I'm seeing immoderation in people in relationship to this. The first is when people say things either in a harsh tone or they overemphasize things in order to drive the point home. And you have to remember, it's not just conveying your idea to this person and how important you think this is, but it's actually objectively, how important is this thing? Second, who am I in relationship to this individual? I'm going to express it in a moderated way to this other person, so that this person, because if we tend to exaggerate things or overemphasize things, etc., when they're not actually to that degree that important, there's built into natural human psychology when we see people doing that to shut off, because we realize this person doesn't recognize the truth about how important this thing is, and so we tend to shut down. It's the exact same mechanism that we see in relationship to It's the exact same mechanism that we see in relationship to when people become really emotional. We tend to just shut down because reason knows that it's built into us that emotions tend to affect our judgment. So when we see a person acting emotionally, we know that their emotions are affecting how well their judgment is, and so we tend to wait until their head clears before we'll actually talk about them. This is something that is extraordinarily important, which the mainstream news media doesn't seem to be grasping. One of the reasons that people are shutting down in relationship to the mainstream news media, your average person on the street, just your normal individual that by and large operates according to the natural law, when they see these people like feminists or people involved in certain racial movements and things like that, when they just get, instead of using a very rational discussion about the topic and therefore being more persuasive to the reason of people and convincing them, instead they become very emotional, and as human beings we tend to just tune them out. It's a natural psychological mechanism, and the more they scream and the more they get, the more we just tune them out. And so I don't think that they're actually and usually what will happen is we'll see the person start getting really emotional, and then all of a sudden the other person in the discussion will bring up something which contradicts what the emotional person is saying. And so then the emotional person starts letting out epithets that have absolutely nothing because their reason is compromised. They can't see the truth in everything, so it's all over, and it's being drug around all over the map by their emotions. So as a result, they end up stating things that have to do with their emotions and not the actual topic of discussion. I've mentioned this before. So, you might say something like, I really think that the question about climate change needs to be taken a serious look at scientifically, because there can be some indicators, or there are some contraindicators of that there isn't global climate change, etc., or there is, but it's not what they're telling us to do, etc. And then the next thing coming out of the person who is a global climate change thing is, well, you're just a racist. Well, racism because they're getting all emotionally worked up. You're a racist, you're a bigot, you're this. And it's basically to throw epithets at you because they're trying to hurt you, to shut you down, because they can't deal with your argument emotionally. And so as human beings, when we're seeing that progression where it's really emotional, and the next thing you know, they're just saying stuff that's irrational, and then people just tune them out. This is why I think a lot of people in our culture are checking out in relationship to the mainstream news media. Okay, so back to this. How you say it has to also be measured. It has to be measured. Now, there are times where emotion in expression is in fact modest, and it should actually be there. So, for example, if a husband and wife are expressing affections for each other, there should be the emotion of delight or the emotion of love in relationship to each other. That should be part of the expression. Or if there is, there can also be certain other aspects of, that if there has to be an emphasis in a particular thing when you're giving a speech, there can be times when there can be a bit of emotion, but even that people have to be able to see that what you're expressing and the degree of emotion are perfectly decorous. That is, they fit each other. If it goes to extreme, you've already lost it. You've lost the modesty question. So how you say it. This also means that it has to be, like I mentioned with anger, a lot of times we say things externally and hurt people out of anger, and it's really because we want the pleasure of the vindication, and that causes the way in which we express it to go to extremes. The way we express it is based upon, again, how we express it. It's based on who I am in relationship to the other person. And so there's certain things I'm going to express in one way to one person and not to another. So if I'm sitting down talking to my mother about some particular aspect of the faith, I might actually have a certain amount of emotion as a reflection of the devotion I have, say, to the Blessed Virgin Mary, and talking it to my mother. But if I'm talking to somebody who's just learning about the Blessed Virgin Mary, then what I'm going to do is be a little bit more rational and unpack the doctrines a little bit better so that they see the truth of it, and then from that, their own emotions will arise. So how I say it is going to determine, is determined according to the person who's receiving it and the person who's giving it. This is based on a first principle, which is whatever is received according to the mode of the receiver. The The biggest mistake we make as human beings is that when we get angry, is we get that inclination, or when we get delighted about something, it can be a whole variety of different emotions, or even sad about something. We presume that if I express the emotion, let's take anger, that if I add more force to what I'm saying, it'll finally penetrate into this individual and they'll get the clue. When in point in fact, if the receiver, B, is not open to receiving it, the more I try and force it, the less the person is capable of receiving it, and therefore they're just not going to listen to it. This is why modesty, again, in regulating our speech, is going to determine how effective our speech is. So how we say it. By what aid? So this is the next circumstances. So by what aid is a circumstances. So for example, if I'm going to torture somebody, I can use different kinds of aids. I can use Chinese water torture, or I could just get a small mallet and keep whacking their kneecaps. Or there's all sorts of different things I could do. By the way, I'm not trying to give people ideas here, but the point being is that there's different aids by which I can use this. It's the same thing in relationship to speech. The particular terms that I use, my mode of expression, how emotional or not emotional, how rational I come across, can itself be the aid by which I'm able to do this. But by what aid usually means a secondary thing that's not part of the very nature of the act, which I use as an additional aid in helping the situation. And so sometimes just specific choices of terms that are made, sometimes, even where I say it, pulling somebody aside, so that's the aid. This person needs corrected. I'm going to pull them aside away from everybody else so that they're not embarrassed, and so that the location is actually the by what aid, St. Thomas says. So there can be different ways in which that's done. Where I say it, I'll give you an example that you'll see from time to time where you can tell there's a lack of modesty. So a couple walks into a grocery store, right? And they're doing the shopping, and the guy's just being quiet, pushing the cart. And then he says something to his wife that he knows is going to press her buttons about something that he would like to be put in the cart. And so he says it, and then, which itself is immodest. Pressing your wife's buttons, being in the grocery store, isn't the place to be doing that. Then, of course, what does she do? She reacts and starts yelling at the guy right there in the aisle. That is immodest as well. And so we start to see that where they're doing this, it's breaking down, or entering into a protracted discussion in front of the children, or arguing in front of the children, etc. That's not the place to be doing it. So where plays a key role. Modesty regulates the pleasure in a situation like that by being able to shut down the desire to talk in that circumstance until such time as a better location can be secured for that discussion. And so that's where modesty regulates this. Now, this is not the time and place to do it, so I'm going to just shut it down. When you say it, this is, in relationship to modesty, that we talked a little bit about this already, is correcting people when you say it. So modesty in speech, we can, not always, sometimes people can go by defect, where the pain in talking to the person and correcting about this to them is such that it's too painful, so they just don't do it. That's contrary to modesty. But then also it can be contrary to modesty when we just correct everybody all the time, because that is also going to be more damaging. And so there has to be, as I mentioned, that ability to make sure that what is said when. Sometimes this is why it takes a while for us to say, okay, it's going to take time before we can start asking people for X, Y, and Z, right? Or start saying X, Y, and Z. We know that this is immodest by some of our more recent experience. I made the statement that you can tell the demons are getting a little frantic, that their time is getting short because they're militating to absurdity. They're driving people to do and say things that are so off the wall, even given how off the wall our circumstances are now. It's that much more extreme that people are backing up and they're saying, whoa, wait a minute, rather than it fitting time and place. They're jumping ahead to trying to gain something because they realize I may not have enough time to get everything to take my time to do it properly. Okay. The next is why we're saying it. So that's the next circumstance. In relationship to modesty, the why often comes through in how we speak, but the why always has to be for the good of the individual. What does this mean? It means that when I'm talking and what I'm saying and all these circumstances ultimately boil down to how B is going to receive what I say, right? And then it fits all of us, time, place, circumstances, etc. But ultimately everything is received according to the mode of the receiver. And so how we, basically why we say it, etc., is going to come through this, but it has to be based upon what is best spiritually for B. That's ultimately should what be determined modesty. When I speak, how I speak, all of those things is going to be determined by what is best for B. This is exactly what you're starting to see online become a problem. Because what you're starting to see is the why people are telling B, X, Y, and Z is because of malice. They want to hurt the person, hurt their reputation, say something against them, talk over them, discredit them, all these different things. They want to say this, and that's a sign of malice. Rather than, look, there's 50 other people here standing around B, so part of B is all the other B1, B2, and B3s. And so as a result of that, I need to make sure that when I say anything, it's going to be what's spiritually best for everybody in the forum, not just the guy that I disagree with, but the actual what's best for them. This is why I have said in the past, it's been about 15 years since I've said this, but it's something that I see over and over again. Catholic traditionalists are some of the most immodest people I have ever met. And I'm not talking about the way they dress. Now, sometimes they go to extremes even in that regard, which is also immodest. Or they say certain things that are just, well, we'll get to that in a minute. But the point is that they will say things and do things out of a desire to, so for example, another thing that can be is that A can be wounded. So you get a lot of trads who are wounded because of all the suffering they've gone through at the hands of various priests and things that are in the church. They love the church, and so it's very painful, and they're talking out of the pain. And so what they do is when they're talking, they're self-medicating. They're basically, I'm going to say this, I'm going to just hammer this guy because it's going to make me feel better, is ultimately what's actually happening. And this is one of the things that you see over and over and over again with traditionalists, because they're in pain. Instead of learning how to suffer well, they've become extraordinarily immodest in their speech by talking too much, which we'll talk about here in just a second, or they talk too much. And so, but why they're saying it is in order to make themselves feel better. I'm going to club this guy over the head so that I feel better, right? And so this is something that you're actually seeing. Because people are saying things that are painful, this is one of the motivations, but it's also the desire, because I think these ideas of mine are more important than they actually are. And this is another thing. Pleasure in our ideas can result in, when we judge the truth of our ideas, it can draw our judgment to excess that we actually think they're more important or that they're more true than they actually are. And as a result of that, we think we have greater certitude about something than we actually have. This is a common human experience. You see this across the board. The person who's constantly talking at everybody, they almost always have an exaggerated certitude about the ideas in their head. And so what they'll do is they'll come in. I'll give you a perfect example. Anytime you talk about any matter of ecclesiology, here's just a couple of topics, and this will help to populate the comment section in this topic, in this conference. Anything that has to do with ecclesiology, who's a Catholic and who's not, baptism of desire. You talk things about can a pope become a heretic? Can a heretical pope lose his office? You just start talking about any of these particular things, and the next thing you know is the comment section, you just made one comment, and then the comment section, there's 1,000 comments from people who literally know absolutely nothing about the topic. It's a complete violation of it's a complete violation of the virtue of modesty. Why? Because, and this is what you see all the time with sedevacantist, you see it all the time with sedeprivatists, you see it all the time privationists. This is something that you see all the time. These guys, none of these guys have studied Cajetan, Bellarmine, the whole ecclesiological manuals that occurred from right after the First Vatican Council up until 1930. They are completely ignorant of that whole series of discussions that occurred within the church on ecclesiology during that time frame, and yet they just barge in because they've got this pleasure in this idea of theirs, and they think they're more certain about it, and, well, it's this, and I know it's this, and etc. Dude, you don't even know what you're talking about. And that's why I keep telling everybody we have a lot of ultra-crepidarians. It's people who just barge in and talk about a topic that they know nothing about. And this has become a disease among the traditionalists. And don't get me wrong, I love traditionalists. I'm a traditionalist myself, so don't sit there and say, why does Father Ripperger always beat up on the traditionalists? Well, the reason I beat up on us is because we should know better and we should be getting our act together. Okay. But anyway, this is one of the things that you actually see that actually has occurred in relationship to this. A lot of times, too, is we can just have a false understanding of something, but because we get a pleasure out of it, we think it's actually true. And then the last one that I need to talk about is called, the circumstance is called what or about what. So this is a circumstance that the moralists talk about. So let's say, for example, I'm standing on the streets of New York, and I see a black man stealing a purse from a white woman, an elderly white woman. Now, I can ask the question, what is that morally? Now, most people are going to jump to a conclusion and say it's theft. And the answer to that is you don't know that. You don't have certitude about that. Given today and given how weird people are, it could be his purse, not her purse. And he could just be restoring his rightful property. B, it could be his wife's purse, or maybe he's trying to get it away from the woman because there's a bomb in it. I mean, not that that's a bit of an exaggeration, but the point is you don't know the condition of the purse, what the actual ownership of the purse is. Okay. So who owns the purse is not a circumstance, but enters, St. Thomas says, into the very nature of the act of what's happening. So before you can judge if that's theft, you had better known, and this is the problem with prejudice, is that it tends to cause us to judge things based upon sometimes even false past experiences, so we automatically judge, oh, well, it's because of this. This is one of the reasons why I'm really annoyed with the mainstream news media constantly putting up people committing crimes on the things, because what it's doing is it's starting to form us to have these prejudices against certain races or even certain groups of people or what have you. And I'm not just talking about blacks, it can also be Hispanics, it can be all across the board, right? So it's just... that's just kind of the nature of the beast. Okay, so that being said, it's not who owns the purse, which is a circumstance, St. Thomas says. It's some quality about the purse which makes it different from other purses. So if, for example, stealing some purse which the woman bought at Walmart off the thing, which is worth like $30, is not nearly as bad. So the quality of that purse, it's a Walmart purse, is different from, is it Gucci? Are they the ones that have those super expensive?
Hermes.
What's that?
Hermes.
Hermes, well, whoever's got the expensive purses today. Back in the day, it was Gucci or whatever it was. So it's a Gucci purse or Hermes purse, whatever the purse is. And you hear about these women who spend like $3,000 on a purse. I'm like, $3,000 on a purse? Why don't you go out and spend $30 and put the rest of it in the savings? But anyway, that being said, they spend $3,000. This is a $3,000 purse. So when he steals it, stealing a purse that is worth $30 is not as grave as stealing a purse that's worth $3,000. And so it's the quality of the purse that is the issue. Now, this is something that is key because in speech, what has to be moderated in relationship to the what is the content of how it is expressed. That is, the words chosen, the phrases chosen, the formulation of how it's to be spoken, etc. So the what here would be you can inform somebody of the truth of a situation. I'm not going to name who he is, but there's a priest online who goes around talking about bishops. And I tend to agree with most of what he says, but the what, the content of what he's saying is bombastic, right? You can criticize the bishops without being bombastic. You can point out the problems in the church without being acrimonious and bombastic. And that's what this guy is making a living on, or at least that's what the appearance of it is. And I think the reason he gets a lot of clicks is because we're back to this whole people are in pain, and so when they hear somebody bombing the thing that's causing us pain, they just get a delight out of it, right? So this is, again, a form of immodesty in speech. Okay. So this is, so if you look at the circumstances, again, what I say has to fit me, the person or persons receiving it, and all the circumstances that surround it, in order so that that in this action, this one action, that action will be virtuous and therefore build my modesty. If just one of those elements is missing, the speech is immodest. And this is something for us to keep in mind. So modesty, again, is one of those last perfected and first corrupted. Okay. Any questions? Yes.
So with speech, comedy.
Yes. Oh.
Sarcasm.
Yes. Okay. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay. Because that actually gets to something I need to talk about. So sarcasm can have its place if the situation is authentically sarcastic, right? But even that, you have to be moderate so that you're not going overboard and things of that sort. So there's certain things that can be done in comedy. And there are certain things that, like, so for example, even in movies, there can be times, because of the circumstances of a movie, there can be certain things that you could legitimately portray in a movie, but you have to be careful because part of modesty is, there's certain things that are inherently immodest, like nudity is inherently immodest. It doesn't matter whether it's on screen or off. It's still immodest. Using terms which can be always construed as immodest can also be the case. So in comedy, you still have to follow the principles of modesty. So you can't use things like profanity and vulgarities and things of that sort. And you can use sarcasm. And you can even kind of come across as condescending because comedy is quasi-acting, right? Because you're portraying something in order to get people to see the truth of something. And so that can be legitimate, as long as it's authentically a sarcastic situation and that it's actually not going to be deleterious to people hearing this. Hearing it, it's not going to be bad for them spiritually. So they can actually do this. One of the things I forgot to talk about in the relationship to the last circumstance, what is vulgarity and profanities? If you look historically in the moral manuals, they always said that vulgarities and profanities were sins against modesty specifically. Now, except for in one circumstance. So if you're talking about so first let's define those two, because a lot of times people don't know the distinction. People say, Father, I was cussing. Well, what does that actually mean? Because cussing is the category, it can be the category, at least in English. So vulgarity comes from the Latin word vulgar, which basically means lowly. It's something that deals with lower body functions. It deals with lower things in anatomy. It deals with lower things. Now, there are certain times when discussing those things or have a proper place. There's other times when using these terms, and I'm just going to be, I'll spell them rather than actually say them, but terms like shit or fuck, things like that. These kinds of words are vulgar because their reference is actually to some created thing in some manner that's lowly by nature. And that lowliness is precisely considered immodest. It's considered immodest not just because it can be offensive to people hearing it. It's primarily sinful, not because it offends people. It's primarily because as Christians there should be a dignity in our speech, or even as a virtuous individual following virtue, there should be a tendency to avoid things that are lowly in common speech. Now, if you go to a doctor and you got to talk about these things, well, then you talk about it. But even then, it requires a certain amount of modesty that's actually discussed. Because there's ways to talk about things that are, modest. So, for example, one time this one guy came up to me after a homily and he says, "I couldn't believe you were able to pull that off." I'm like, "What do you mean?" He said, "I can't believe you were talking about the sin of sodomy, but you kept referring to it as the sin of the people in San Francisco," right? Because everybody knows what that means. I don't have to use the word sodomy because sodomy itself is one of those things that is a bit jarring, and you normally shouldn't hear it from the pulpit unless you're talking about this is what, And even then, there should be, there's such lowly things that they shouldn't normally be spoken, but you still have to talk about them. And so there's manners in which you can actually talk about these, given the proper circumstances. But outside those circumstances, because they're lowly, they do not fit the dignity of a Christian, and therefore they're immodest based upon the who. So the what is a violation in relationship to the who. So that's in relationship to vulgarity. Profanity is the use of some sacred name or some sacred word, such as God, Our Lady, the Trinity, the words Mary, Jesus, and stuff like that. So when people use these terms in a situation, so when they're using these terms either in a derogatory fashion or they're using in terms that they don't fit, and the way you know it's profanity is because it does not fit one of two circumstances. It's either not demonstrative. So if I say God is all-knowing, that's a demonstrative use of the word God. And then the other one, or in devotion. God, I love you. Outside these two contexts, it's considered profanity because it's a sacred thing that you're using in a way that is contrary to the sacrality of that word. And so it can only be used in a dignified fashion in a manner whose nature is such that it's ordered towards something dignified. Outside that, it's venially sinful in relationship to profanity as a general rule. St. Thomas says, if you use something sacred with the intention, because a lot of times people use profanity without even thinking about it, which is most of the time. But if you have the intention of denigrating God's name, then it becomes blasphemy. So sometimes you hear blasphemy, these two terms used interchangeably, but historically in the theological discussions, blasphemy was specifically, I intend to denigrate God's name or Our Lady's name by using it in a derogatory manner. Whereas profanity is, I'm using the term, but I'm not, that's not my intention, it's just to emphasize something or what have you. Okay. All of these, so vulgarity is specifically against modesty. That's its primary thing that it's against. It could be against other virtues too, but it's primarily against that. Profanity is also against modesty, but it's also contrary to the virtue of justice, specifically in relationship to the virtue of religion. So it's a sin against religion, principally and primarily, even though secondarily it's against modesty. Okay. So even in relationship to movies and things like that, they say, oh, well, it's in a movie. Doesn't matter. It's not demonstrative and it's not devotional, therefore it's acts. And the vulgarity is such that, and as one comedic, he's an actor, but he's also a comedian who talked to me, he said, well, I've always avoided the vulgarity stuff to the degree that I can. He said, because once you go there, it's automatically a sign you don't have any material. And you have to resort to this because your material isn't worth laughing at, but you just use these terms to get people to laugh. Okay. So, any other questions? No? Okay. Well, if you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et semper. Amen.